Kind of tell us your story about how this vision of family teams came about.
Yeah, well, I grew up in the Seattle area, and my whole experience of family in that context was just a lot of brokenness. There's a lot of areas in the country and in the West where marriage and family feel like kind of like a experiment that has gone bad. Just so much brokenness. It's like, what's wrong? And watching so many of my friends and other families sort of almost want to exist in a post-family context where it's like, maybe this is a bad idea. Maybe we just cohabitate. Maybe we just have pets. And, I had a lot of empathy for that perspective because I had seen that brokenness. It's weird when you make a commitment and assume it's going to last forever, and it so rarely does. It's like, what's going on there? Um, and so, in the context of that, I was 23 years old and had moved to Jerusalem for a semester abroad, and was struck during that whole 4 month period of how often I was seeing dads with kids. Everything from the airplane to just hanging around, walking around the city of Jerusalem, both in Jewish and Arab cultures. There's a lot more interaction, and it seems like almost a lot more passion between fathers and children. That was very strange for me, just culturally. I grew up in a really solid family, but in that context, I just hadn't seen that, publicly and so broadly. And so I was like, what is going on there? Where did they get this idea? And so I started really dialing down and to try to understand it. And as I began to study how they saw family, they saw it so differently than I did. So the two kind of ways I would contrast this is in our culture, we really think about family as a kind of a springboard for individual success. So you've done a great job as a mom or a dad if your kids are thriving, if they've launched out of the nest, and everyone is excited about their own individual pursuits. If the mom and dad especially have their own individual lives, and those are solid. Those are things that we really want to see, and we don't want to see the people doing a ton of sacrificing for the family if it comes at the expense of their own individual achievement. Contrast that with really the way that classical cultures thought about family, which they really saw them as a multi-generational family line. And there was a desire to see that family line progress and that it's a multi-generational project. And so you see in a lot of more classic cultures, grandparents with grandchildren, there's sort of like a progression to watch each generation. There's an understanding of like one generation sacrificing a lot for another. You see this in our country, with first and second generation immigrants, but it seems like it just disappears after a few generations. And so I really began to study that and became really kind of interested in the prospect that, oh, maybe the way that classical culture saw family actually makes a lot more sense of its structure. And the reason why it's breaking down in our culture so completely and so constantly is because we don't really understand its basic architecture, that it's actually multi-generational and that the family is designed to work together. And when you really begin to peel away all of those elements back down to their individual components, or what sociologists call the atomization of culture, where every person really is very kind of hyper individualistic, then you can understand why the family doesn't function the way that you would expect it to. We're almost like living in the ruins of a ancient idea, and we have to each of us make a decision. Do we believe in that idea? And if so, we've got a lot of sort of archaeology to do to try to understand like how to make it work, because the trajectory we're on, it's like we almost need to reinvent it. So you really have to choose which path you want to go, like reinvent the way that we think about family, we think about these kinds of familiar connections, relationships, raising children, or sort of begin to mine the past for wisdom about the way that this is actually designed to work historically and classically. And in my case, as being a believer, also biblically, there's a lot of verses in the Bible about family. All of them assume this sort of classic idea of family as a multi-generational team. And so I began to realize I can pick one of these, but if I choose to pick something different than the springboard for individual success, the way that the culture currently defines it, I'm going to have to almost relearn everything about family and kind of be re-equipped from the ground up to think about family totally differently. And so that's how it sort of started for me.
Yeah, that's just amazing. I mean, I'm gonna kind of just go personally with you because my mind is starting to shift. I mean, you're starting to get really into my head, and I'm starting to think about. So, for example, I have a 14-year-old daughter, and my wife and I are having lots of conversations. Is how do we, in the next 3.5 years, she's going to be 18 years old. How do we springboard her so that she can be, independent, be successful on her own? And you're talking, and it's almost like then we can let our hands off the wheel, I guess, right? It's like we just want her to springboard into individuality. So, but you're starting to talk about this multi-generational family and family on mission. So can you dive a little bit more deeper into that? Like, so I can kind of rethink a little bit about just my 14-year-old.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so that's the story that I was certainly immersed in. I didn't even know there was another option. It's like then trying to help your children be as individualistic as possible. Um, so the way that I guess ancient cultures thought of that, first of all, for them, that would have been an incredibly dangerous idea. So if you raise your children to be very individualistic, then in a time frame or a place in which there are real dangers constantly coming at you from wars to famines, to disease, and that the family was just constantly being hit by one wave after another of crisis. If you launch all your kids out, you would be in big trouble. Um, and so that's why what you're describing only really begins to become even an option in a place where you live in a relatively safe and stable culture for over generations. Um, and what I began to wonder, and this is kind of where I got really excited about this as a dad, if you study if you begin to live in a culture like ours, and you have this, what sociologists call the assumption of stability, which is what creates that individualism. If you choose not to go down that road and you choose to live like a team instead of like a group of individuals, if you study the very, very small percentage of families that have made that decision, they have an enormous influence over the culture. Um, and their ability to build multi-generational wealth, their ability to really do much greater things is vastly magnified. And you could even talk about that. Probably you could tell the story of even our American culture based on the few number of families who've chosen to continue to live multi-generationally because they've had such an outsized influence in politics and business. And so I think that whereas I would say it's certainly fine to launch kids out, like I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. Um, I think that it may be very short-sighted to think that way.
Hmm.
And I first thought about this, I thought about it in Israel, but what was interesting, so this caused me to want to start businesses instead of just be an employee for my whole life. And so I began to do a bunch of entrepreneurial businesses. Again, it wasn't necessarily because I felt like I was particularly wired to be an entrepreneur. It was really thinking about the future and wanting to work with my family and wanting to have access or control over my schedule and my work enough so that I could integrate them into family. And my first business that I started, we brought on an investor, and I remember every month I'd go to a board meeting, and he would sit there with his. He had three sons. They were all in kind of their late 20s and early 30s, and he would spend 3 hours in this board meeting. Oftentimes, he would pause the board meeting to teach his sons different things that were happening in our business as kind of like teachable moments or launching pads for his for helping them because they were going to inherit. They were partnering with him and beginning to steward this large portfolio of businesses. Um, I remember one time sitting in that boardroom, it suddenly occurred to me that this man was spending more time with his sons in their 30s than I knew of any dad spending time with their kids while they were living at home.
Mm.
And I, that really got me thinking. I was like, is that like that's really interesting? And I made a decision at that moment, and I had I think three little tiny kids at that point. And the decision I made was I don't necessarily I never want my kids to feel forced or like they have to work with me or something like that. I think that there are seasons where it's really healthy for kids to go off or for them to especially spend time figuring things out. But the decision I made is if one of my kids wants to work with me, in their 20s, 30s, 40s, whenever. I want to live a kind of lifestyle where that's a possibility. I don't
Mm.
want to live a kind of lifestyle where that's impossible. And I'm curious what will happen if we do that. And so we made a decision to do that as a family when our kids are really young. So that, now my kids are 21, 20, 17, 15, and 12. I have five kids. And so the 21-year-old, her primary job is working with my wife. They started a sewing studio. And then she also works with me in family teams. My son and I started a real estate investment company. And so we're experiencing this because we made all kinds of, decisions while our kids were young to live a kind of lifestyle in which it's possible to integrate them into elements of our work life. And what this has created is, and this all comes out of this idea that maybe families were actually designed to work together.
Thank you so much for checking out the Brett Snodgrass channel. If you like this video, please slam on that like button. And if you really like it, then subscribe to our channel here. And remember to leave us a comment below, and I'm going to try my hardest to reply to all the comments. Thank you guys so much. This is why I do what I do. Every single week, I come out with content that focuses on success, freedom, and living out your purpose. Thank you guys so much. See you next time.